This happened back years ago. My parents had left our home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for a 3-day business conference, and I was left in charge of my 15-year-old sister Megan. I'm 17, and though I'm finishing my senior year in high school, I already have my eye on the local community college's schedule. My parents trusted me enough to keep an eye on the house while they were away. So agreed that Megan and I would be fin on our own the first night felt normal enough. Megan and I ordered takeout and watched some late-night TV in the living room around 11 p.m. She started feeling uneasy. The house creaked in the wind, and every small noise seemed to echo in the emptiness. I tried to calm her down, joking about how our old pipes and drafty windows like Ed to perform at night. Eventually, we both got tired and headed to bed despite feeling a little wongy, and managed to drift off quickly, and the night passed without any trouble. These day went by like any other. Megan spent the afternoon on the phone with her friend chatting about a biology project, while I played around with a new design program for my final semester project. We barely thought about the previous night's jitters by evening. I had to finish some coursework, so I set up in the living room with my laptop, occasionally glancing at the news on a local channel. Megan decided she wanted to cook something simple, pasta with tomato sauce, around 10 p.m. I could hear pots clanking in the kitchen and the running faucet as she filled up a pot for boiling water. Then out of nowhere, I heard a sharp scream. I dashed into the kitchen, my heart thumping, and found Megan pressed against the counter. Her eyes were wide and she pointed toward the window. Over the sink, she whispered that she'd seen a man standing outside staring in. That there, according to her, he was covered in blood, fresh dark smears across his chest and arms, trying not to panic. I rushed to the window to see for myself. The porch light was on, but there was none in sight. The backyard looked empty except for some overgrown shrubs. It tried to calm Megan, telling her maybe she had imagined it, but she was visibly shaken after a few minutes. We decided to keep the kitchen blinds closed and make a quick meal. Neither of us had much of an appetite, but we forced ourselves to eat. We double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before going upstairs for the night. I offered to stay in Megan's room until she fell asleep, just in case she needed someone close by. Eventually, I went back to my own room, thinking the worst was over. At around 3 a.m., a loud knocking shook the front door. It sounded urgent, angry, almost like someone desperately trying to force their way in. My heart started racing, and I froze in my bed. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably just a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. I was too scared to move. I listened intently, hearing nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The rest of the night was quiet. Megan and I got almost no sleep by morning. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went outside to check around the property. I grabbed a bag of trash from the kitchen and headed toward the garbage bins near the side of the house. That's when I saw a figure laying face down in the grass near our small vegetable garden. At first, I thought maybe he was injured, so I inched closer, calling out to see if he could hear me. When I finally stood over him, I realized he wasn't breathing. Blood covered his shirt and his face. Waist turned away, it felt me stomach tighten. I didn't recognize him at all. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone to call the police officer. Henderson arrived with 2 other officers, carefully examining the body. They asked Megan and me a barrage of questions. Had we heard any gunshots? Did we see anyone outside? Could we identify the man? We told them everything, how Megan saw someone the night before the knocks at the door. The officers looked concerned, but they were just as puzzled as we were. They removed the body and told us they'd be in touch if they learned more whenever Even got a name for him. None of our neighbors claimed to have seen anything unusual, and there were no missing person reports that matched the description. Mom and Dad came back later that afternoon, worried out of their minds when they heard what happened. They questioned us over and over, but we had no more answers to give. Megan was still rattled, and I couldn't explain the feeling of dread that had settled into the house. To this day, none has ever identified the man or discovered why he ended up in our yard. The police never found any evidence of foul play aside from his injuries, and they offered no closure about who he was or how we got there that night. We were just 2 teens trying to manage on our own, and we got pulled into something we still don't understand. All I know is that every time I pass by that kitchen window, I can't help imagining what Megan saw: a figure standing there in the dark, covered in blood, watching us through the glass. And I keep asking myself the same question: why our house, why us? We never got an answer. Last month, my husband Nate and I decided we would spend a quiet weekend at our old family farmhouse in rural Missouri. Nate serves in the USA Army stationed at Fort Leonard Wood, but at the last minute his request for leave was denied. He told me I should still go and bring our kids, Addis, who's 8, and Connor, who just turned 5. It was supposed to be an easy getaway from the bustle of city life. I've driven trucks for years, picked it up for my dad, who worked long hauls most of his life. So the plan was for me to load the kids into our old Dodge Ram and then head to the farmhouse alone. It's about a 3-hour drive from our house in Springfield to the property near a little town called Willow Falls. Normally the route is pretty serene, stretches of 2-lane highway, rolling hills, and farmland as far as you can see. That day, June 15th, we left around noon. The kids were excited, rummaging through their backpacks of snacks and coloring books, while in navigated the back roads. The weather was decent, low 80s, a little breezy, and there wasn't much traffic, honestly. It felt relaxed. Driving a familiar route with minimal congestion can be almost therapeutic. We were maybe an hour into the drive when in noticed a beat-up maroon sedan trailing behind us first. It wasn't anything special, just another car on the road. But after 10 minutes, I realized it never tried to pass, and we were on a stretch with dotted lines where passing would have been easy. It just hung there a few car lengths behind, matching my speed. It tried to shake off any worry. Drivers can be cautious, or maybe the person was just zoning out, but something felt each time a speed up slightly. These danded too. If his load, it slowed. The kids were oblivious, chattering about the games they'd play in the farm house's backyard. Eventually I decided to test my gut feeling. It turned off the main road onto a smaller route, where I usually wouldn't go. Sure enough, these then followed. That knot of anxiety for meat in my stomach. Still, I kept telling myself it might be a coincidence, as some local who happened to be going the same way. After another 10 or 15 minutes, these Dan sped up and got close enough that I could see the driver's face in my side mirror. He looked to be middle-aged, maybe mid-40s, with a baseball cap pulled low. Couldn't tell the color of his hair or see his yes clearly. For a moment, it thought they might try to pass me, but I hung back again. It was like he just wanted me to know he was there. Addison noticed how often I was checking my mirrors and asked if everything was okay. I nodded and told her I was just being a careful driver. I didn't want to alarm them, especially not Connor, who was already scared of the simplest things like bees and thunderstorms when we're a small convenience store off the side of the highway. I decided to pull over and see if these then would do the same. The gravel parking lot was nearly empty as his load to turning. I watched this Dan pass by on the highway. It didn't stop, didn't even brake. I exhaled a shaky breath, figuring that was the end of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. The kids and I ran inside for a quick restroom break and some drinks. Everything felt normal again. I chatted briefly with the clerk about the weather in the local farmland. No mention of a suspicious driver. We hopped back in the truck, and I felt more at ease back on the road. About 20 minutes later, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. Again, it was far backs, so I couldn't tell if it was the same maroons. Then still, I kept glancing every few seconds, trying to confirm with the sun hitting my mirror. It was almost impossible to be sure, but the shape of the headlights looked eerily similar. I kept driving, my heart thumping a little faster. At one point we hit a bend in the road with a slight incline, and I lost sight of the car. When we came out the other side, it was gone. Just gone. Part of me was relieved, another part was unsettled. How did it vanish so quickly? To turn off onto a side road or just pull over somewhere? A few miles later, the kids started complaining that we're hungry. I was too. There was a rest area about 5 minutes up the highway, one I've used in the past. I signaled and took the exit off, expecting the maroon sedan to appear in my mirror again, but it never did. The rest stop was practically empty except for one semi parked at the fair, and I parked close to the rest building, making sure to stay near plenty of light. We got out, stretched our legs, and scanned the area. No sign of that car, no sign of any cart that resembled it. My head was on a swivel though, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. We used the facilities, grabbed some vending machines, snacks, and sat at a picnic table for a few minutes. Another driver, an older woman, walked by with her dog and gave us a polite nod, but didn't say much. I started feeling a little silly, like maybe I'd blown the situation out of proportion, so we loaded back into the truck, ready to finish our trip to the farmhouse. I kept checking my mirrors as we merged back on the highway. Nothing strange, just normal vehicles, random, missed the usual. The rest of the drive was smooth when we finally pulled onto the dirt road that led to our old farmhouse. The kids cheered. The sun was setting and that warm glow settled over the fields. The tension I'd been feeling began to melt away. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. I lost my princess back in 2012. It still hurts to say it out loud. Even now, we were living in Brooklyn at the time, and she passed so suddenly that I didn't have a chance to prepare myself. Visiting her burial site, 8 Greenwood Cemetery, became something I did whenever I felt too overwhelmed by memories. It was my quiet place to reflect, to speak excellently to her and to keep her close. If you've ever lost someone dear, maybe you know the pull of Ace Meadery at night. There's a strange sense of comfort in the stillness, but I guess it's also a bit eerie to be around so many graves when the sun goes down. For me, it used to feel like I was sharing a private moment with my little girl, hoping she could hear my thoughts one evening. I couldn't sleep. It was late around 10 p.m. and this wave of sadness just took over. The urge to see her rest place was too strong to ignore. A close friend once cautioned me about hanging around cemetery grounds after dark, but I couldn't help myself. In my mind, it was her anniversary that night. Thought the exact date had passed a few days before. I convinced myself that I needed this visit more than anything. The air was unusually still and the temperature had dipped, even though it was early fall. By the time I arrived at the gates of Greenwood Cemetery, it was approaching 10:30 p.m. Under the dim glow of a distant street lamp, I noticed how empty the street felt. There were no cars, no passers-by, just me stepping onto the pavement with nervous energy swirling in my chest. I'm not proud of this next part, but the gates were slightly ajar. I know the cemetery technically closes at dusk, but sometimes the staff forget to lock up one of the side entrances. So maybe they assumed everyone was out. Either way, the door gave with a little push and is lipped inside. Greenwood Wood Cemetery is massive by day. It's serene, filled with beautiful sculptures and winding pathways at night, though shadows claim very corner and the comforting hush of daytime turns into something ominous. My footsteps on the gravel seemed unnaturally loud, crunching with every step. I tried to walk softly as if not to wake anyone as I made my way to my daughter's resting spot. I found myself glancing around. It felt like someone was watching. It's silly. I know I've been there dozens of times and not once had I encountered anything more frightening than a stray cat, but there was this strange weight in the air, almost like the cemetery was holding its breath. When I reached her headstone, I knelt down, feeling the damp grass soak through the knees of my jeans. I whispered a few words, things I wished I could have said before she passed. My eyes started to tear up and my voice quivered. Maybe it was the quiet or just the raw grief, but I began to notice noises I'd never heard before, soft scuttling behind me, the faint shuffle of feet, or maybe just the wind. That's when I saw them off in the distance. At first, it was just one figure, then two, then three, standing in the faint moonlight. They seemed to be wearing long white gowns. My immediate thought was that maybe they were caretakers or some volunteers doing a nighttime ritual, but caretakers in white gowns that since they moved in a slow, deliberate way, not speaking to each other. Their heads turned in unison, scanning the rows of graves. I didn't hear any voices, but I felt the tension spike in my chest. Something about their presence didn't seem right. It tried to reassure myself that it could just be a family performing a memorial vigil or maybe a group of midnight paranormal enthusiasts. But the longer I watched, the more unsettled I felt. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. The fear of drawing attention to myself was stronger than my curiosity. Instead, I slowly rose to my feet, ready to head back, but the moment I stepped away from my daughter's grave, my shoes scuffed the gravel and made a loud scrape. One of the figures snapped its head toward me. Though I heard the sound clearly, my heart pounded at that moment. I realized they might come over. I didn't know what to expect, kindness or threat. It took a few careful steps backward, hugging the curved line of head, stones I tried to keep my footsteps light. Then I risked a glance over my shoulder. All three figures were coming toward me, still at that steady, silent pace. I couldn't figure out their expressions because the moonlight gave them blank, pale faces. My stomach nodded and noticed there was no clear sign of a flashlight or any other illumination with them. They just glided forward, gowns brushing the ground. They moved faster, winding through a narrow path lined with tall, ornate tombs. By now my mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why were they there? At that hour, dressed like that? My memory blurred as I turned corner after corner, trying to find the main path that would lead me to the exit somewhere behind me. I heard what sounded like whispering, low and urgent. It could have been the wind sifting through the gravestones, or it could have been them. I felt the prickle of panic intensify, and I realized I was getting turned around in the dark. Normally, I knew my way around, but the fear made every turn look unfamiliar. After what felt like an eternity, the faint glow of the street lamp near the entrance appeared between the silent silhouettes of mausoleums. Relief surged through me, and I all but sprinted till the gate was still half open, and his lip through it, nearly stumbling onto the sidewalk. I paused, trying to steady my breathing for a moment. I considered calling the police. But what would I even say that I saw three people in white gowns? It sounded so bizarre, almost comical, and they hadn't done anything explicitly illegal that I could prove. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Across the street, parked in the shadows, was an older model van. Its headlights were off, but there was someone in the driver's seat, watching me. The shape in the window leaned forward. When I exited the gate, my pulse hammered in my ears again. I couldn't see any detail, just a silhouette. Before I could react, the van's engine started, headlights remained off, and it rolled down the street. With a dull hum, I stood frozen in place until it disappeared around the corner. I hurried home, darting glances over my shoulder the entire ways. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Questions spiraled in my head. Were the three figures connected to that van had stumbled onto something I was never meant to see, or were they just random strangers maybe performing a late-night ritual for their own reasons? I haven't returned to Greenwood Cemetery after dark since that night. In the daylight, it still feels peaceful enough for me to visit my daughter's grave. This story takes place back in 2010 to 2012. I was about 10 to 12 at the time. My dad was newly divorced from my mother and moved out to a rundown trailer park. It was off a main highway, was basically a dump trailer park. There were all kinds of people living there. There crack sheds, drug dealers, illegal immigrants. There was no discrimination. This place was not safe for children, but this was all my father could afford after being left. With nothing from my mother, he was given weekend visitation, and we would goover there from Friday until Sunday. I have 3 sisters, 2 older and 1 younger. We were all about 3 years apart. Ranging from 8 to 14 years old. My dad still had to work on Saturdays and would tell us to stay put inside. But of course, whenever did. The lot consisted of 3 lanes of trailers, and actually my aunt on my mother's side lives on the same lane. Since her trailer was the last one when my dad was at work, we would do kid things like run around the fields in the backyard, or I do. Find other kids, top lay with my older sisters, didn't have trouble making friends their age. But my younger sister, and only had each other most times. We'd play by ourselves away from our sisters, only because they would kick us out of their circle and say this was the big kid group. This one time we overheard our older sisters and their friends say they wanted to go down to the creek. We were never allowed to go to the creek without our dad because it was pretty dangerous to get to it. You had to go past the last trailer, which was my aunt's, and then go through the small clearing until you find a drop-off. Then at the drop-off was every deep hill, and not a smooth hill. Either you had to be cautious going up and down, or you could fall about 10 to 15 feet down. You were basically rock climbing the side of a hill. We used tree roots and makeshift steps to climb in, and once you make it to the bottom, there is sand and streams of water in the rainy seasons. The streams would fill up and a current would form. Sometimes my dad would bring his fishing gear and fish up the stream, or we would put on clothes we didn't care about and swim around in the steam. When we found out my sisters were going there, we begged them to come along. Initially they didn't want to, but thought we could make a day out of it and swim for a bit. All geared up in our swim cloths, grabbed our towels and headed down to the creek on Ove. My sister's friends had 2 small dogs who would follow us very where, so they're tagging along. Was normal if it drained a few days earlier, so the climb was going to be tricky since it was still pretty muddy, but we've done it tons before. When we got to the drop-off, we saw it was way more muddy than we expected. My sisters who were pros at climbing were struggling to get down, and it made me a little nervous once they got down. It was only me and my little sister started to climb down. But I was still hesitant. I got a weird feeling and didn't want to go anymore. But I also didn't want to go back home. Either my sisters were getting irritated and said if I didn't come down, they were going to leave me. Finally, I gathered the courage and made the descent. Surprisingly, I made it down with no struggle. When I got to the bottom, my sisters and their friends were talking about a game plan while they were discussing. I started to wander around the sand in the creek. There were many trees and branches surrounding the area. I still had a weird gut feeling, but thought it was because I was worried I had to climb back up the muddy drop-off. After a few more minutes, we were on the move. We walked a few yards down the stream. The dogs were sniffing every tree and marking their territory, while everyone else was walking in the ankle-high water. The water was clear and you can see the pebbles at the bottom. As we were walking, we noticed a new tree had fallen. It was huge. Too luckily, it didn't fall across the water path, but it looked like it fell into the creeks. It was sort of above us. Weck knew it trained, but didn't know it was so bad a tree fell. One of the girls pointed out that the only thing that was stopping the tree from falling onto us was a tree root that was coming out of the ground. We all surrounded the tree and away for a few minutes before we decided to continue walking. Suddenly the dog started to bark like crazy. Honestly, it startled all of us because no one else was around, and it was pretty quiet out. They started running around and running up to different trees, barking erratically. We just thought it had to be a bird or a squirrel. My sister's friend was trying to calm her dogs down, but it wasn't working. Everyone started to speak at once, trying to calm the dogs out of nowhere. We heard a loud noise. It sounded like thunder almost. It trembled and echoed. It was getting louder, and realized it was twigs snapping, but not any kind of twigs. Well, collectively looked at the fallen tree and saw the root that was holding it start to snap. Will started to freak out. The tree was now slipping down the slope right at us. I was too scared to move. My sisters were calling my name to get out of the way, but I just couldn't move my legs. Everyone looked at the tree, and as it started to fall further, a literal hand reached out from under the slipping tree and grabbed onto a smaller tree to stop it from falling. Everyone saw it and burst into screams. They all started to run back to the drop-off. Event the dog stopped barking and ran with us. I stayed a little longer to look before running with them. The hand wash huge, the fingers were so long, it wrapped around the tree trunk. It was also camouflaged to match the greenery around it. It well climbed the drop-off quickly. We were all muddy after, but that didn't matter anymore. As Will caught her breath, Wes started explaining what we saw. Some say they didn't see anything, but only ran, because where another said they saw the hand, stayed quiet and just stood in shock. The other quickly dismissed it and went on about their day. But I decided to go back home to this day. I still don't know what it was, but I know for certain it saved you, Saul. Now that I'm older, I can kind of figure it could have been an alien or even Bigfoot. But that's a crazy accusation. It definitely wasn't human because it had super strength. But if it was an extraterrestrial or anything like that, it sure did save a handful of kids from being squashed by Agent Tree Trunk. I wasn't expecting anything unusual when I booked that cruise out of Miami, Florida. Honestly, I just wanted a break from my part-time job and college deadlines. The plan was simple: soak up the sun, eat too much at the buffet, and maybe catch a decent show on the ship. Little did I know this trip would haunt me long after a step back on land. We set sail on a bright Thursday morning. Everyone on board was buzzing with excitement. I remember standing on the deck watching the city skyline shrink behind us, thinking about how I finally had a chance to relax. The first day was honestly great. I spent most of it by the pool sipping iced drinks and casually chatting with other passengers that evening. I noticed Dagai hanging around the corridors near the cabin. She was older, maybe in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a pale complexion. At first, I figured he was just another passenger like to wander, but something about him seemed off. He kept glancing around, almost like he was nervous or guilty. It tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. By day 2, the atmosphere shifted. I caught sight of that same man a few more times. It wasn't just a random spotting on the deck. He always seemed to be nearby, whether I was in line for the buffet or walking through the ship's souvenir shop. I don't even know why. I noticed, but every time I looked up, he was within earshot, staring, then quickly turning away. My stomach twisted in knots every time our gazes met. That night I had trouble sleeping. The cabin felt stuffy. Evan thought the AC was cranked to the max. It turned on the TV some late night rerun of an old sitcom, but the dull laughter only made me more uneasy around. I thought I heard someone jiggling the handle of my cabin door. I froze, heart pounding, and waited for it to stop. Eventually it did. Could have been some drunk passenger confusing my cabin for theirs, but the thought of it made my skin crawl. On the third day, I tried to shake off the paranoia by signing up for a shore excursion. A bunch of us took a small boat to a private island for snorkeling. It was supposed to be the highlight of the trip. I barely enjoyed it though, because the entire time it felt like I was being watched. The weirdest part was that the man didn't join our group, but I still couldn't relax. My mind kept going back to that uneasy feeling I had on the ship. When we got back on board, I headed to my cabin to shower. The hallway was nearly empty. Most people were still out on the island or at the bars. Then I caught a glimpse of him in my peripheral vision. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, his eyes locked on me. Before I could react, I slipped into a stairwell. I felt this surge of panic, like I needed to do something, but my body wouldn't move. That night, I went to one of the shows in the main theater, thinking the crowd might help me feel safer. Partway through the performance, I noticed the man a few rows behind me. I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. We hadn't spoken. Not even once. Either kept popping up in my vicinity. Why I couldn't handle another restless nights. So I decided to head out onto the deck around midnight, hoping the sea breeze would calm me down. It was nearly empty for the first time in days. I felt a little more at peace, but then through the dark, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned around and saw him standing there, maybe 25th away. He was leaning against the railing, staring out at the ocean, but I knew he had seen me come. Outside, I didn't wait to see what he would do. Me heart raced as I rushed back to my cabin, practically sprinting down the narrow hallway once inside. I shoved a chair under the doorknob, feeling ridiculous for overreacting, but not caring. On the final morning, we docked back in Miami, and I scrambled off the ship, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. As I waited to pick up my luggage, I glanced over and spotted the man. He was standing alone, suitcase in hand, not even pretending to be busy. He just stared in my direction with the strangest expression, like he knew something I didn't, or maybe he was just satisfied. We never exchanged words, never had a confrontation, yet something about his presence left me unnerved in a way I still can't fully explain. I've been home for a few weeks now, trying to get back into my usual routine. Still, every time I drift off in class or zone out at work, I think about that man. Who was headed he even know he was scaring me, or was it all in my head? Sometimes I catch myself checking over my shoulder, half expecting to find him watching from across the street. I guess I'll never really know. It's just one of those things that cling to you, refusing to let go. I've just recently quit being a full-time police officer because I had such a traumatic incident that I just can't let goof. No matter how much I want to, it was March of 2021 in the daytime, and I was on duty. I was at a restaurant drive-through, and just recognized someone had a warrant out for his arrest. This name is Dennis Gilder Jr. As I'm opened the passenger door in a red car, and the driver drove off. While I followed behind about 30 seconds to a minute later, it turned on my sirens, and the car stopped. Another officer got out of the police car, and we both walked up to the car. He walked up to the driver's seat, while I walked up to the passenger seat. I already saw that Dennis had the windows pulled down a little, and there was a woman in the driver's seat. I had to be one to tell youth is, but it sounds like you've got a warrant out of Illinois. I said to Dennis. Ethan asked him for his ID, but he said he didn't have it on him. Ethan asked him to step out of the vehicles. I could identify him. He didn't listen to me. I asked him about 4 to 5 more times to step out, and he still didn't listen. I was still being respectful to Dennis, but patience was growing on me. All of a sudden, I saw Dennis roll up his window fully, and he pushed the woman out of the driver's seat and crawled over to where she was. The woman was trying to get back in the car, and it was as if she knew that something bad was about to go down. It then stepped to the front of the car, and I ordered Dennis to stop the car and to get out. I went from patient to now being impatient. The other officer reached into the car and tried to stop Fime as well, but it didn't work. Dennis started to drive now, and I got onto the hood of the car and crouched down with my gun drawn in my hand, pointing at Dennis. For the first 20 seconds she was driving slowly, and I was hoping that he would ultimately listen to me. As more seconds went by, he started to speed up, and the car was now going at 40 to 50 miles an hour. I was beginning to fear for my life. I was now on the car's roof, and as Dennis was still speeding, my weapon flew off and one of my shoes flew off of my foot. A train was driving on the tracks ahead, so Dennis made a left. As was still on top of the car. We were now heading towards a construction area, and he saw a ditch. We're now approaching in it. The car hit a bump which caused me to be thrown off of it and landed really hard on my back, and I broke my vertebrae in the lower back. The police cart then came and stopped within seconds of me being thrown off. Dennis kept driving, and he was gone out of sight. I lay there in agonizing pain and was unable to move. Medical help came minutes later. As the other officer had called for it, I was transported to a hospital where I was treated for my injuries. As hours went by in the hospital, the whole police station where I worked came to the hospital to make sure that I was okay and living. The sheriff told me that Dennis was able to drive for another mile before the car ceased to function, and then he stole another vehicle from someone's garage. He also told me that Dennis did not own the red car, and as a matter of fact he stole it, and of course he was arrested. The woman who Dennis was with was unharmed and was able to be returned home safely a year later. Dennis was found guilty, and the year after that he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. I will to return to work 3 months later, but I eventually quit at the end of 2024 due to being so traumatized from that incident. As I said at the beginning of the story, I'll never forget the feeling of holding on to something like a car going very fast and trying not to lose my life. It took me a year to fully recover from my broken vertebrae, and now I'm more careful whenever I do something related to strength because I don't want to re-injure my back. Dennis apologized to me. I forgave him when he gets out of prison. I honestly hope he turns his life around for the better and becomes a better person in 2017. I had taken my SUV deep into the wilderness, far from paved roads and towns. It was a multi-day off-road camping trip, and I craved isolation. My plan was simple: find scenic spot, park and camp under the stars. I filled my tank with gas, packed plenty of water, and brought other necessary things. It felt our sense of freedom as the city disappeared in my rearview mirror after hours of navigating rocky paths. I found a small clearing near a quiet stream. The water barely flowed, but its soft trickle made a soothing backdrop. Towering pine surrounded me, casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower. There were no signs of people, just the rustle of leaves and birds calling in the distance. It was perfect. I set up camp, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As darkness fell, I sipped tea and watched stars dot the night sky wrapped in a warm jacket. I felt at peace, alone but content. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the quiet. When the chill grew sharper, I retreated to my SUV. I had converted the back into a makeshift sleeping space, removing seats so I could stretch out after zipping myself into a sleeping bag. It turned off the lantern and closed my eyes. The silence was comforting, and I fell asleep quickly. Sometime later, I woke up abruptly. A sound reached my ears, low, rhythmic, and distant. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It sounded like chanting. I froze, listening. The voices were faint, carried by the breeze. My mind raced. I hadn't seen anyone for miles who could be out there. Why would they be chanting in the middle of the night? I grabbed my knife from beside my sleeping bag and strained my ears. The chanting continued, faint but unmistakable. My heart pounded as I debated what to do. There was no battery, and now way to call for help. I Told myself it was probably a group camping nearby event, though it made little sense. I gripped the knife tightly, forcing myself to lie back down. Somehow I drifted off again, the sound still lingering in my mind. Then came the knock. It started softly, tapping against the glass SUV. My breath caught in my throat. The tapping grew louder, deliberate. My pulse raced as I tried to stay silent, barely daring to move. The windows were fogged from my breath, but I could see a faint shadow, a face pressed against the glass, peering inside. Instinct took over. I let out a loud guttural scream, something primal and raw. The figure jerked back, start-led for a brief moment, as all wide eyes staring at me before they turned and vanished into the darkness. No sound of footsteps, no breaking branches, just silence. I sat frozen, clutching my knife, my chest heaved as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that? What did they want? The questions swirled in my mind. It started the SUV flooding the clearing with light. The headlights revealed only trees and shadows, no sign of the person who had been at my window. I kept the engine running for over an hour, scanning the woods and jumping at every small sound when exhaustion overtook me. I reluctantly turned the engine off to conserve fuel, gripping the knife until my hands at cacked morning brought some relief. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the ground around my SUV. In the dirt, I spotted footprints, small and faint, as though someone had been barefoot. My stomach churned at the thought. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest, no longer felting. I needed distance. As a for spot, I drove for hours, following winding dirt roads that seemed endless. Every sound put me one, every shadow made me flinch. Eventually, I came across another clearing, this one near a rocky hill. The sun washed eye, casting warm light over the area. It felt safer than the last spot, though. I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I spent the afternoon staying busy, checking my gear, gathering firewood, and trying to distract myself. But as the sun began to set, my nerves frayed again. I built a larger fire than usual and set up a circle of sticks around my camp, hoping they might alert me if someone approached that night. I sat by the fire, sipping a small cup of tea. Shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed alive, shifting with the flickering flames. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that face at my window refused to leave. The night felt heavier, as thought the forest was holding its breath when it was time to sleep. I locked myself inside the SUV, again clutching my knife. I barely drifted off before another sound woke me. Branches snapping near my eyes flew open, and I reached for the keys. The sound grew louder and closer. I started the engine, throwing on the headlights. For a moment, is a nothing. Then in the distance, a figure darted between the trees just beyond the light's reach. It froze me. Heart pounding, the figure was too quick to make out any details. They were there, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife and jumping at every noise. When the first light broke through the trees, I packed up and left for good, driving back to civilization. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced in my mirrors, constantly half expecting to see someone trailing behind. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. The tension in my chest eased slightly. But the questions remained. Who had been out there? Why had they come to me camping? And what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in